From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, my name is Mary Lou Rieker, and on behalf of the Center for the Book, the Office of Scholarly Programs, and the John W. Kluge Center, I welcome you to a talk by Mark W. Geiger entitled Financial Fraud and Guerrilla Warfare in Civil War, Missouri. You want to make sure your cell phones are off, okay, because this is being recorded. Mark W. Geiger is an economic historian and a scholar of the American Civil War. He is currently a 2011 Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress and has previously held postdoctoral fellowships at UCLA and the University of Sydney. Before embarking on his PhD in history at the University of Missouri, which he acquired in 2006, he studied at Carleton College and the Wharton School of Business. He also held positions in financial services on Wall Street and elsewhere, and much of his historical scholarship draws on his prior workaday world experience. Today, he will discuss the book, Financial Fraud and Guerrilla Violence in Missouri's Civil War, 1861 to 1865, published by Yale University Press in 2010. The book, which has received rave reviews in academic journals, describes a previously unknown banking conspiracy in Civil War, Missouri. While the conspiracy plot failed, it nevertheless set off a series of worsening consequences that ultimately cost thousands of people their property and sometimes their lives. Dr. Geiger's work has won many prizes. This year alone, he has been awarded the 2011 Tom Watson Book Prize from the Society of Civil War Historians, the Francis B. Simpkins Award from the Southern Historical Association, and he has received honorable mention for the Lincoln Prize in American Civil War History, awarded by the Gilbert Lerman Institute and the Gettysburg College. His dissertation, on which that book is based, received the 2007 Allen Nevins Prize in American Economic History, awarded by the Economic History Association on behalf of Columbia University Press. Mark's permanent home is in Chicago, where his wife is an associate professor of English at the University of Chicago. And as a Kluge Fellow, he is working on his next book, A History of the Early Chicago Board of Trade. That book, like his first, will explore the influence that networks of personal relationships exert on the formal economy. So please help me welcome Dr. Mark W. Geiger.
Thanks, Mary Lou.
Sure.
Well, hello. Thanks all for coming. I'll start today with a question we've all heard. Why study the Civil War? The war ended long ago. It's already the subject of a vast body of work. One reason the war remains important is that for many Americans, myself included, the war is in us. My family lived in Missouri in the mid-19th century, and we have 5 or 6 stories handed down from the Civil War era. The time the bushwhackers surrounded a church during a Sunday service. A great-great-uncle called out of his house and killed in front of his wife while she held their newborn baby. How my great-grandfather hid in the brush for weeks on end. I didn't read these stories. Can't hear me? Does this work? Is this any better? Does this work? Can everybody hear me? Okay. I didn't read those stories, and the family genealogist didn't dig them up. I heard them from my oldest living relatives, and they heard them from their parents and grandparents. I suspect millions of other living Americans, including many people in this room, carry stories like these. And all the Americans whose families immigrated after the war share that atmosphere. We live with the shadows of our ancestors. One such family story, a short one, led me to the initial discovery that eventually resulted in this book. My father told me my grandmother was named Rose Anderson. When she was a girl, her father was shot down in the streets of Boonville. Why? I asked. Who shot him? I don't know, my father said. We don't know anything about him. I asked what his name was. No one knows now, my father said, and there's no one left to ask. They're all dead. I grew up knowing that story, and some years back I decided to research it. I found that my great-great-grandfather was an uncontrollable wild man, and knowing what I do now, I'm surprised that he lasted as long as he did. I also noticed, while I was looking into his sordid affairs, a large number of defaulted debt cases in the Cooper County, Missouri Circuit Court records. These cases had many odd features. First, the same defendants appeared over and over in different combinations. A and B signed a note payable to C. A and C signed a note payable to B. B and C payable to A, and so on. Second, judging by their names, many of the defendants in these cases were Southerners. I saw names like Pike Thompson, Jackson Quisenberry, Lacey McClanahan, Presley Marmaduke. What else could they possibly have been? I also saw that none of the defendants had German surnames, which suggested that these were men of Confederate sympathies. Large numbers of German immigrants had come to central Missouri in the 1850s, and when the war came, they were almost unanimously pro-Union. Finally, I found that while the court records of many counties had these unusual defaulted debt cases, their distribution was uneven. For example, I counted 68 and 122 cases, respectively, in Cooper and Pettis counties, which adjoin each other. But Morgan County, which adjoins both Cooper and Pettis, had no cases at all. So these cases were not fallout from the wartime destruction of Missouri's economy. That affected everybody, regardless of ethnicity, sectional origin, or county boundary. Rather, these cases affected specific people in specific counties and fit a pattern that had no obvious cause, a pattern where there shouldn't have been a pattern. I worked in financial services before I took up history, and one job that I held was to manage an audit department that investigated fraud. In auditing, unexpected patterns set off alarms. I found that what lay behind these debt cases was a previously unknown financial conspiracy that began in early 1861 in Missouri. At that time, during the secession crisis, nobody knew what Missouri would do. If Missouri had seceded, the war might have ended differently, given the state's population, resources, and its strategic location. Most Missourians rejected secession, but a determined minority wanted the state in the Confederacy. The secessionists included the newly elected governor and senior members of his administration, as well as many of the state's business leaders. This much history is well known. What I'm now going to relate is my contribution. While the Missouri legislature deadlocked over issues related to secession, the governor and his friends conspired to divert money illegally from the banks to arm rebel military units then forming throughout the state to take Missouri out of the Union by force, if necessary. The banks would extend short-term financing, since no one expected a long war. The way the plan went, after the nation had split and things had settled down, the new Missouri Confederate state government would sell bonds to repay the banks. Nearly all of Missouri's bankers favored secession and were ready to cooperate. The plan was sound, too. The governor of Alabama had financed that state's militia in just the same way some months earlier. The difference was that in Alabama, the governor's course of action had broad popular support. The Missourians had to work in secret. But fighting broke out in St. Louis and in Boonville in May and June of 1861 before the conspirators could move the money. Federal forces overturned the Missouri state government and chased the governor down to Arkansas. After that, the St. Louis bankers could do nothing to help the rebels because the city was under tight federal control. Federal authority did not extend, however, into the interior of the state. There, I found, some 30 branch banks paid out their money in return for thousands of promissory notes signed by local, wealthy, pro-Confederate citizens, usually the bankers' own relatives. This was risky business by any normal standard. These were unsecured loans for large sums compared to the signers' own assets. But the men who signed these notes did not think they would ever have to repay the money, nor did the bankers think so. Missouri's Confederate government in exile pledged repeatedly to repay any debts incurred for the defense of the state, as they termed it. The larger Confederate government made the same guarantee. So the rebels got the bank's money after all, about $3 million worth, equivalent to $75 million in 2009. But it was a poisoned victory. Union forces managed to hold the state, and the South lost the war. As federal troops gradually regained control of the countryside and smaller towns, they purged the pro-Confederate bankers from their positions and replaced them with Union men. Starting in early 1862, these Union-controlled banks filed lawsuits in the civil courts to recover these by now defaulted loans. These are the lawsuits, over 2,900 of them statewide, that I first noticed in the Cooper County Circuit Court records. I eventually found these lawsuits in 40 counties, over a third of the state, an area the size of West Virginia. The lawsuits marked a turning point. The wealthy Missourians who signed these notes had, in effect, loaned money to a Confederate Missouri state government that did not yet exist, and that now never would. Now, instead of compensable war claims, these notes represented private debts for which the signers were personally liable. By 1862 and later, these men had no liquid assets left. They hadn't been able to farm for at least a year. Their slaves were running off to join the Union Army, and the federal authorities had imposed fines, assessments, and bonds on pro-Confederate civilians. But the signers still owned land, and that is what they lost in the lawsuits. As I mentioned earlier, most of the defaulted notes had multiple signers, usually 2, sometimes 3, occasionally more. For a long time, it was unclear to me why the people who signed these notes chose the specific co-signers that they did, instead of other people. Eventually, after exploring several other possibilities, I found that ties of family connected the co-signers to one another and to the bankers as well. By modern American standards, many of these connections were distant, though they were clearly important to the people involved. The groupings of co-signers were, I found, only a tiny glimpse of the extended family networks that connected these people. The bankers and signers were bound by family alliances already generations old by 1861, often dating to the pre-revolutionary Southern Tidewater region and surviving multiple migrations into Missouri. These lawsuits, therefore, were not evenly distributed among pro-Confederate Missourians. Instead, the lawsuits disproportionately affected the network of elite families, the planters and their dependents, and their relatives, the bankers. As a direct result of the lawsuits, eventually nearly 350,000 acres of land went under the sheriff's hammer. But damage from the lawsuits probably extended beyond the original borrowers. There were no bankruptcy laws then, state or federal, that could have scheduled an orderly payment of debts. One objective of modern bankruptcy law is to forestall a chain reaction of further bankruptcies. Otherwise, anyone facing a sheriff's auction would mercilessly hound his own debtors, if he had any. The absence of a bankruptcy law meant that insolvency could spread from house to house like a fire. The leading family's economic, social, and kinship relations were so intertwined that whole extended family networks went down at once. As a result, today Missouri has an insignificant southern-descended rural gentry compared to other former slave states. Because of this catastrophe, Missouri's planters lost more than their counterparts in the Confederacy proper. There, former planters managed to keep their land after the war, but the Missourians did not. Also, the plantation system itself survived the war, but in Missouri it did not. Not all the Missourians accepted this new order quietly. Many younger sons of these ruined families joined the guerrilla bands that marauded through the state. Missouri would have experienced guerrilla violence anyway. All the border states did. But the extra recruits who joined the guerrillas because of the indebtedness and land sales pushed the violence in Missouri over the top. The state became the site of the bloodiest and longest guerrilla insurgency ever to occur on American soil. Putting the events in Missouri into context, I found that in 1861, communities all over the country, north and south, were using the same grassroots financing to arm their young men that I discovered in Missouri. In that era, no government, national or state, had the money, the administrative capacity, or the legal authority to mobilize for a major war. Instead, both hostile sections armed in the way the United States had in all its previous conflicts, through local action and private contributions. As eccentric as the system seems now, it was consistent with the prevailing prejudice against standing armies and all that comes with them. But only short, low-tech conflicts can be supplied in this way. Private citizens and organizations can equip troops initially, but they can't support them in the field during an extended campaign. Both the U.S. and the Confederate War Departments knew this, and from early in the war took steps to rationalize logistics and financing. By late 1862, both sides had switched to more modern methods of military supply. Until the end of the war, however, private organizations played a more important role in military support than they do now. But never again did the United States rely on private initiatives for military mobilization. So, I hope that you find this interesting and that you read the book, and if you do, you like it. None of what I just told you was known before I researched it and wrote it up. I now want to comment briefly on the larger topic of Civil War scholarship. The way the evidence came together for this project suggests, I think, some possibilities for future research, both for the kinds of sources that we look at and for the ways that we look at them. A week ago, I gave a version of this talk titled "Follow the Money" to the Society of Civil War Historians. Many of you will recognize that phrase as Deep Throat's memorable advice in All the President's Men. I chose that title for two reasons. First, it describes much of what I did to research the book. But I also wanted to point to the usefulness of money in historical investigation. Despite all the work on Civil War history, certain types of primary sources represent a vast pool of largely untapped data. This is definitely true of financial sources. People love money, but hate looking at financial records. This near universal loathing provides employment for tax preparers, investment advisors, accountants, bookkeepers, and auditors. Most historians share this distaste. So I'll make a pitch for giving money a more important place in historical investigation. Money is everywhere, it's easily measurable, leaves plentiful records. Money has owners, always, and people often fight over it. People use money to express their personalities. At one extreme, some people obsess over this stuff. I worked on Wall Street for several years, and I met many such. The pro-secession Missourians whom I studied, however, were almost the opposite. Family and patriotism, as they understood it, mattered far more to them than money did. Still, it was the financial records that revealed these attitudes. Such records often require some special handling. Taken out of context, isolated transactions are meaningless. Viewed separately, the defaulted promissory notes that I studied are indistinguishable from ordinary bad debts. These debts only revealed their special significance when I grouped many of them together. By following the money, you could say that I thought like an auditor to research these materials, but I did not use any specialized auditing techniques. I looked for unusual transactions, sorted them, sequenced them. I identified the people whose names were on these transactions, and I looked for connections among these people. And at every stage of the chain of events that I uncovered, I found out who gained and who lost from what was happening. I did use two specialized techniques for analyzing large data sets: prosopography and social network analysis, which some of you may have used in your own researches. One serious problem of working with sources like these is that they are dull. Documentary sources in which people talk to other people are much more interesting for everybody than quarterly banking statistics published in 19th century newspapers. My sources were mainly of the second type, which posed a problem. To write a serious book, I had to list my sources and explain the steps of my analysis. But I didn't want to kill the readers, so I pushed all of the analytical apparatus into the endnotes, appendices, and onto the Yale University Press online site. The machinery worked. It revealed a previously hidden story of corruption, violence, and the downfall of the rich and powerful. That was the important thing, and I didn't want to get in the way of it. I'll finish now with a reading from the book. This passage is from chapter 6, Guerrillas, and starts on page 111. At times, some of the surviving wartime accounts of central Missouri look like Unionist and rebel versions of the death story. Neither the Missouri Guerrillas' post-war memoirs nor the writings of their publicist ally, John Newman Edwards, name loyalty to the South or commitment to slavery, secession, or states' rights among the reasons for taking part in irregular warfare. The narrators do, however, often speak of defending their homes and their honor and seeking to avenge northern outrages. Modern readers usually assume that such statements refer to wartime atrocities, as is often doubtless the case. But then as now, outrage can also refer to gross or malicious wrongs or injury done to feelings, principles, justice, or morals. A Southern man in Missouri's Boonslick region, central Missouri, needed to look no further than the circuit judge or the county sheriff for this kind of outrage and a reason to pick up a gun. The history of James Waller of Lafayette County shows how one family constructed its memory of a particular outrage. In 1861, Waller was a prosperous 31-year-old farmer, married with 6 children and owning 6 slaves and 1,000 acres of land. When the war broke out, Waller and 2 other men co-signed 2 promissory notes. By early 1863, the suits were in court. By mid-1864, the Lafayette County Sheriff auctioned the defendant's property. In mid-1863, Waller, described in a newspaper article after his death as previously having been a well-respected citizen, joined Andy Blunt's guerrillas. In March 1864, a detachment of the Union, 1st Missouri State Militia Cavalry, while chasing Blunt and his men, shot Waller. In his report, Captain James B. Moore noted much sympathy for Waller among the local citizens, but described Waller as a notorious bushwhacker who took part in the murder of 2 unarmed Union men and the storming of a jail. Waller had also been involved with the infamous raid on Lawrence, Kansas, and he bragged of having killed 14 men there. By 1870, Waller's widow and surviving children had left the area. Walker's descendants, however, remember his story differently. In the family version, Waller owned a large plantation in Lafayette County, which he did not, and Union troops murdered him when he refused to reveal where he had hidden his fortune. The soldiers then burned Waller's house and set his slaves free over their objections. The family version thus preserves the outline of the true events. Union authorities took Waller's property and killed him. Lawsuits are not the stuff of legend, however, and as the family tells it, it was not the courts but the soldiers who took Waller's property. The family account omits any mention of Waller's bushwhacking or any reason for his death other than the Union soldiers' cold-blooded robbery. The history of the Warren family of Lafayette County is also suggestive. The Warrens originally came there from Virginia via Kentucky, and by the outbreak of the Civil War, they had lived in Missouri for decades. In 1860, they were a thriving clan in Lafayette County, with 51 family members in 8 households and ties of blood and marriage to a dozen other families. Together, the Warren households owned 79 slaves and over 2,500 acres of land. The outbreak of fighting in Missouri in May and June of 1861, most of the young Warren men joined the Confederate forces. At that same time, 8 Warrens, fathers, sons, brothers, uncles, and cousins, from 4 different households co-signed 11 different promissory notes, which defaulted in late 1861 and early 1862. In November 1862, in Lafayette County, General Benjamin F. Lone, the commander of the Union District of Central Missouri, arrested the officers of the Farmers Bank of Missouri, which had discounted these notes, and replaced the officers with Union men. By early 1863, the bank, under new management, filed lawsuits in the Lafayette County Circuit Court against the Warrens and more than 400 other defendants who had signed promissory notes in late 1861 and early 1862. Each of the 8 Warrens was sued on average twice, and each household 4 times. In 1863, while these suits were in court, the newspapers and military records named 3 young Warren men from the indebted households as members of a guerrilla band led by Dave Poole, one of William C. Quantrell's lieutenants. In July of that year, the Warrens shot their way through a German community in their old neighborhood, indiscriminately killing 4 people and wounding 6 or 7 more. The legal outcome: a month later, Poole and the Warrens joined in the Lawrence massacre. The legal outcome, of course, remained unchanged. Judgments in the 11 cases totaled more than $3,600, forcing the sale of the 4 households' entire property in 1864. By 1870, of the 8 Warrens who were defendants, 2 had left the state, 2 had disappeared, 1 was dead, and 3 remained in Lafayette County, owning only modest property. 3 of the 4 households were gone. Missouri's war did not end with the peace in 1865. The state took nearly 20 more years to settle down. The guerrilla fighting left behind a perpetuating cycle of violence that was hard to stop. Michael Fellman writes that in the region most ravaged by guerrilla war, violence permeated society and degenerated into a war of all against all. The poet Eugene Field, returning in 1871 to his native Missouri after a long absence, wrote that, quote, "Life and property were held of slight consequence, violence obtained to a preposterous degree, crime actually ran riot," unquote. Field found violent crime worst in those areas that had suffered most from the guerrillas. The nation had viewed Missouri as a southern state before the war. In the years after the war, Missouri became the unique and disgraceful robber state, as it was called in the Eastern newspapers. In the U.S. Senate in the 1870s, Missouri Senator Carl Schurz's colleagues